There are a few things in life that are so sure we often take them for granted. Think about how you breathe, or the right-left pattern of walking, things we do with barely a conscious thought. But for Larry Baden, this reality was quickly turned on its head as he walked up the bleachers at a college football game. The normal step pattern was suddenly interrupted when his right foot didn't get the memo.
I almost went face first in the bleachers because my right foot just didn't do what it was supposed to do. I was able to catch myself on the railing so I didn't fall, but I'm like, okay, that's weird. And I'm like standing there and I'm thinking, move, move, move. And it's just frozen. And it kind of freaked me out because I'd never, ever had an issue like that.
The moment stuck with Baden for a few days, but like most other things, it was soon forgotten in favor of more pressing issues, like grading papers from his college students. However, he would soon realize that his body had a problem it wasn't going to deal with silently.
2 weeks later, I was in a training session, newsroom training in upstate New York. And I noticed one of the reporters was like staring to my left. And I couldn't figure out what he was staring at. And I looked, and my left hand was shaking.
Within a few days, the tremors had migrated into his right hand as well. The first neurologist Baden saw brushed him off with a glance at his hands and age, stating it was simply a case of essential tremors. But feeling like it was more than common age-related shaking, Baden sought out a second opinion. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. But as time went on, Baden developed more symptoms that aren't seen in the usual Parkinson's patient. For example, he began to physically act out his dreams while sleeping, a dangerous situation for both Baden and his wife sleeping right beside him. It was about 3 years into his Parkinson's diagnosis that Baden's doctor decided to reevaluate his condition. After various testing and more strange symptoms, his medical status changed for the worse, as doctors guessed Baden's real issue was multiple systems atrophy. It's a rare and terminal neurological disorder.
So symptoms can be problems with motor control, such as being more clumsy, discoordinated, having imbalance, or having problems with movements themselves. So they can look like Parkinson's disease in many cases early on, where people may have slowness of movements. They may have difficulties with doing fine motor tasks. There may be some rigidity, so there's stiffness of the muscles.
That's Dr. Sonia Schultz, a neurologist and senior investigator at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. Another telltale sign of MSA is problems with the autonomic nervous systems. These are functions we don't usually have to think about, like breathing, sweating, and bladder control. Though there are a lot of unknowns about MSA, including what causes it, the last couple years of research have revealed that patients with MSA have a buildup of misfolded proteins called alpha-synuclein in the brain.
And we believe that this accumulation ultimately leads to some damage to the nerve cells and ultimately to the disease progression. It interestingly affects one particular type of a brain cell called the oligodendroglial cells, which we don't understand why that is. And it is different from other kind of neurological diseases that also have buildup of this particular alpha-synuclein protein that can often share a lot of similarities.
Parkinson's is one example. These patients have the same protein buildup, but the molecules are folded differently than what we see with MSA, affecting a different type of brain cell.
Unfortunately, it is a disease that is relentlessly progressive. So it affects patients relatively quickly, so over a course of several months, and within about 5 years, about half of all patients are already wheelchair bound. So there's an increasing level of disability that is affecting the patients, and it comes out of nowhere.
The first year was difficult because, one, it's kind of embarrassing when you're shaking all the time, especially when you're a teacher. And I use my hands a lot when I talk. And so, when they're going crazy, I got very self-conscious of it. And I was also very self-conscious about walking with a cane. I'm like, okay, now I have a cane and people will look at me differently. Because now you're a guy who has a cane. So now you're the first someone sees you, someone meets you, and their first thing is like, oh, this is a guy who has a disability. And that really, I hated that.
But the need for assistance outweighed Baden's defiance when he fell down concrete steps on his college campus. The balance issues are just one of many symptoms Baden deals with on a daily basis. And sadly, an MSA diagnosis comes with a promise that things will only get worse, a fact his doctors had glossed over.
Neurologists, at least the three I've had, haven't been gifted at interpersonal communications. I remember when I went back to my second neurologist and said, hey, maybe you should have told me that this thing like basically has a pretty short lifespan to it and the death is pretty horrible. You might want to have mentioned that.
MSA is a fatal disease. The average survival is around 6 to 9 years. Baden is a few months past the 9-year mark. He's beaten the statistics so far. While many patients are bedbound by year 8, Baden recently traversed the hills of Scotland with his cane. However, his doctors have warned him not to get too comfortable because once the tides turn, it's a quick descent. Baden's been advised to not plan more than 6 months out. And though there's no cure, there's also not an easy way to manage the debilitating symptoms. In many cases, Baden says that fixing one issue creates problems with other parts of his body.
One doctor is telling me I need more caffeine so that I can stay awake during the day. And then my gastrointestinal guy is telling me I need less caffeine because it puts me at risk of kidney stones.
The symptoms are tough to treat because the disease is attacking so many different parts of the body. Unfortunately, another issue is simply that there's not enough research around MSA as a whole, which is why patients can only manage the symptoms instead of fight the disease itself. In an effort to close this knowledge gap, Schultz was part of a research team that set out to understand the condition at a genetic level. Since MSA doesn't run in families, they wanted to see if there were any other genetic components, and it turns out there are. The paper, published in the journal Neuron, is the first to identify a few risk genes of MSA.
So those are genes that, may not work quite as well in somebody who has the disease versus somebody who doesn't. They can be quite common in the population, but it tells us something about where there is a problem in the cell. So it's essentially, if you think about the cell as a complex machinery, those are some of the squeaky wheels that we can pinpoint. In this disease, there are always squeaky wheels in this particular pathway, in this particular structure.
The research was done at over 20 different sites across North America and Europe. Scientists performed whole genome sequencing from blood samples of nearly 8,000 participants. 900 were diagnosed with MSA, and the other 7,000 served as control samples.
Then we looked across the entire genome, that's about 3 billion letters in length. Where are differences in those who have the disease versus those who don't? And we identified 4 different regions in the genome, and were able to pinpoint potential areas and potential mechanisms that could be involved. And so we were able to identify that there are genes within protein handling machineries that seem to be affected or at least associated with risk for disease. It's statistically significant, but it's not enough to cause the disease. And in particularly, we see that it's affecting the cell type that we know has a lot of the pathology, the oligodendroglial cells.
These findings provide a starting point for various studies on molecular and cell biology as it relates to MSA. Now that researchers know which genes to look at, they can start to manipulate them and see how each change affects the disease. But again, we're barely off the starting blocks with this research. It'll be years before real headway is made in terms of therapeutics. Too long to wait for a dying man. Though Baden's beaten the odds so far, there's no telling when his condition will take a turn for the worst. So instead of scrambling to grasp as many more days as he can, Baden's decided to cherish the quality of each one he's gifted.
I start every day with, okay, I want to do something today that's going to bring me joy. I want to do something today that will positively impact another human being. And I want to, kind of be as pain-free and normal as I possibly can be.
It's not always easy. In fact, depression has been a lifelong struggle for Baden, one that's only gotten worse with his diagnosis. However, the constant battle is often won by the bursts of joy that only come from living.
In March, I came home from school one day and I was just done. I had lost it in a classroom and yelled at a student. And I'm riding the train home and I got off at one of the stations very seriously thinking about just if does the train come into the station fast enough to end it? And that's where I was. And then probably about a month later, something happened and I was like, oh, you know what? If I had made that decision then, I wouldn't have had experienced that great moment that I just had. And, so that's kind of what it's about. It's like I still want to experience those moments where it's like, yeah, I'm glad that I'm still here. Went to Louisville with my son for 4 days and we had a lot of those moments. And it's like, you're overdoing it, you're overdoing it. And I'm like, yeah, I won't be able to walk tomorrow, but that doesn't matter. Right now, we're living.
Baden shares more of his thoughts on living and dying in a conversation with our producer, Kristen Farah. That can be found on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. There you will also find more information about Dr. Sonia Schultz and multiple systems atrophy. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.